Hello and welcome. My name is Terry O'Neill, and I'm the president of the National Organization for Women Foundation. We are delighted to bring you today a presentation by the Honorable Rashida Manjoo, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Ms. Manjoo, after conducting a fact-finding mission to the United States earlier this year, issued a report on the causes and consequences of violence against women in the U.S. and presented it to the United Nations General Assembly on Monday, October 10, 2011. She has graciously agreed to lead today's webinar to summarize her findings. Many organizations have worked together to assist the Special Rapporteur in her U.S. mission, and I will identify them at the close of this webinar. But first, a few words about the Special Rapporteur. Ms. Manjoo, whose home country is South Africa, was appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women by the UN Human Rights Council in 2009 for an initial 3-year term. An attorney at law, Ms. Manjoo is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa and is a former parliamentary member of the Commission on Gender Equality in South Africa. She has taught and conducted research at a number of universities. She was an Eleanor Roosevelt Fellow with the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School and is a research associate in the law faculty at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. The position of Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women was established in 1994 by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. The mandate for the Special Rapporteur is to seek and receive information on violence against women, its causes, and its consequences from both governments and non-governmental organizations, including women's organizations. And secondly, to recommend measures to eliminate the violence and its causes, and to remember its consequences. In carrying out her mandate, the Special Rapporteur undertakes fact-finding country visits and submits reports on those visits. She was invited here by the United States government and conducted her fact-finding tour in January and February of 2011, holding meetings in Washington, D.C., North Carolina, Florida, Minnesota, and New York. Her purpose was to conduct a broad examination of violence against women in the United States, including violence in custodial settings, domestic violence, violence against women in the military, and violence against women who face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, particularly Native American, immigrant, and African American women. Special Rapporteur Manjoo will present a summary now of her findings, and then she'll answer questions that were submitted in advance. I give you Rashida Manjoo.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for organizing this, and this is a unique way of communicating basically the substance in a summarized form of my mission report. The challenge, of course, for someone in my position is after a mission is over, it is really difficult to come back to a country to track what's going on or to even figure out whether the report has been disseminated both at the state and the non-state level. So I am grateful for this opportunity to present the findings of this report. As Terry has mentioned, this is a fairly large country compared to most countries that I visit, and the manifestations of violence against women in different countries and different contexts are different, but there are certain commonalities. One of the commonalities is that domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking is a global problem and is, unfortunately, the most prevalent. These are the most prevalent forms of violence against women that I see in the work I do, and it's not unique to the U.S., or the U.S. isn't exempt from these kinds of violations of women's human rights. Due to having been briefed by some amazing advocates within the U.S., academics, practitioners, activists, I also focused, it was a 2-week mission, and I had to narrow down the focus and what I would look at. So the other areas that I looked at in the report covers the categories of violence against women in the military, in custodial settings, which included prisons, detention centers, immigration detention centers particularly. And they looked at the issue of violence against women who faced multiple forms of discrimination, particularly African women, immigrant and undocumented women, and Native American women. My last report to the Council stresses that the intersectionality approach needs to be adopted so that women who face multiple levels of discrimination and which lead to many forms of violence against women need to be factored in, and this report, for the first time in a country mission report, I selected 3 categories, and this is not exclusive, but these were the 3 categories that came across for the U.S. that I needed to focus on in terms of multiple forms of discrimination. Next. So my findings in terms of the domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking violations that that were brought to my notice in the U.S., the problems of underreporting. And there were many, many reasons given for underreporting, and 3 that I've selected for this presentation. One was fear of retaliation from the abusers, the perception that the police will not respond, and feeling that these are private issues that should not be brought out into the public domain. There was also reluctance to reach out to the police amongst minority and immigrant communities, and I think that's self-explanatory, where people do not feel a part of the landscape of the country and feel that when they reach out to the police or to the criminal justice system in general, it is more punitive on them even though they're victims. Inappropriate responses by the police was also highlighted, and this wasn't restricted to immigrant and minority communities, but across the board, where the police felt that in terms of policing, these were, these violations of human rights against women could be resolved through encouraging informal resolutions between parties, and their failure to conduct adequate investigations also came through. Criminal trials were another aspect which was highlighted about the non-convictions or convictions for misdemeanors or cases being discontinued or dismissed, depending on the locations. There, when I think about the location that we went to, which is in Hennepin Country in Minnesota, which had a one-stop model of prosecutions, etc., the response was different, but we were also informed about the responses of the criminal justice system not being consistent across the country. Next. Also, in relation to this aspect of the report, victims being arrested, charged inappropriately, being wrongfully convicted as perpetrators. So acts of self-defense. There's no analysis in an incident of who the primary perpetrator was, and acts of self-defense, and victims were being arrested and charged as well. Victims having their children removed by child protective services and being accused of failing to protect them from their abusers was another aspect of one of the consequences of reporting to the formal system, whether it was the social welfare system or the justice system, reporting on abuse. Custody proceedings which coerced women to agree to plea bargains or to attend dispute resolution procedures, and in many instances the voices of victims was that batterers continued to harass and intimidate them through these proceedings. So the sense of powerlessness comes through where there's coercion by the state officials about plea bargains or mandatory programs, whether it's dispute resolution or batterers programs, that these also open the door to batterers continuing harassment and intimidation. Another reason for reluctance to use the formal justice system or the formal systems that exist technically was economic instability, loss of employment, and homelessness. And I do address this issue of loss of employment when women have to run up and down, whether it's to social welfare services or justice services, etc., and take time out from work, and the punitive effect of that in the employment sector. Homelessness as well, landlords evicting families that are considered troublesome despite some progressive legislation in this sector, because both the victim and the perpetrator are seen as the problem, and landlords wanting to get rid of them. There's also the issue of sexual and reproductive health consequences, so birth control sabotage, limited access to contraception, abortion, and other reproductive health services that were reported in relation to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Next. The issue of violence against women in the military. Some of the allegations that were brought to my notice was failure to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. Victims were subjected to retaliation and discouraged from reporting, and there were, at a very practical level, reporting barriers despite any kind of policies or programs or laws. That the reporting barriers included a very hierarchic and command-driven structure, lack of confidentiality, fear of punishment for collateral misconduct that actually served to deter women from reporting within the military acts of sexual violence perpetrated against them. Next. One of the a group of women that we spoke to who had all been sexually assaulted during their time in the military, compared their experiences and tried to distinguish how sexual assault impacts a woman who's in the military compared to civilian survivors. And this wasn't about creating a hierarchy of suffering or of harm. It was at a very fundamental level, the feelings of betrayal which are experienced by survivors who are in the military hinge on the fact that in the military there's a high expectation of support and loyalty among service members. And there is a strict sense of respect for the chain of command. And one survivor described sexual assault in the military as equivalent to a situation of incest, in which victims face the trauma of being raped by a brother who supposedly has her back, and then having to make the difficult choice of reporting the abuse to a father figure who does not believe them. And it raises very clearly the issue of power and powerlessness. These are women serving in the military who describe their experiences and their feelings of betrayal and their powerlessness in the face of this hierarchy, this command-driven structure, and a culture that precludes women from being comfortable, even though there are systems in place for reporting, etc., which is quite a challenge because I'm sure that the state feels that there are programs and policies in place so that there is confidentiality, that people can report, but at a very interpersonal level, the experiences of the women that I spoke to indicate that despite having systems in place, the challenge is at this very fundamental personal level of feeling powerless to report because of the culture in the military. Next. My mission, in a sense, follows up on a 1998 mission by my predecessor. And my predecessor had looked at violence against women in custodial settings in 1998. And some of her findings included there were high rates of incarceration of disadvantaged women, as she called them, particularly racial minorities. Whoops, my screen just went blank. Sorry. Oh, forget that. So the findings from the 1998 mission highlight the high rates of incarceration of disadvantaged women, particularly racial minorities, which is something that my mission confirmed. the severity of sentencing for drug-related offenses and lack of alternative rehabilitation programs, especially for women with children, something again that my interviews confirmed that it still existed. Lack of gender-specific healthcare services, including sexual and reproductive health, mental health, substance abuse, and counseling. In some of the centers that I visited, in some of the custodial settings, this was an aspect that there have been some positive developments. The challenge, of course, is limited resources and competing demands. So in many instances, the interviewees reflected that they had long waits to access a dentist or have a scan done, etc. So, they felt that despite the services being available, in practical terms, there were long delays to access these services, and some of the mental health programs that were running were not catering in a substantive way to the satisfaction of women who are incarcerated. The issue of restraints, the use of restraints, particularly on pregnant women or women who are in giving birth, was an issue that came up again despite a policy agreement that restraints would only be used, a policy document which indicates that despite that restraints would only be used if there was a real danger, a real possibility of danger. And unfortunately, it seems like not all detention and all custodial settings take this policy requirement very seriously. And one of my recommendations is that I think that there should be a law that mandates certain standards in terms of when restraints can be used and what are the grounds for trying to restrain a woman who is going into childbirth. The lack of minimum standards with regard to state practices in women's prisons, especially as regards sexual misconduct for staff, again, there have been developments at a legislative and policy level. The challenge has been implementation of such guidelines or laws at different levels. The sexual misconduct allegations still exist, and the response by some of the authorities in these custodial settings was that they have tried to make the system user-friendly, the inclusion of confidentiality, creating a responsive environment, etc. The challenge for women is that the sexual misconduct by staff leads to other forms of penalization, and most of you, having read the reports that come out of people, that have emanated from experts who work in the sector, know that the issue of power and powerlessness plays out, but also in terms of implementation, there are challenges of implementing laws and policies at the level of the custodial setting. Privatization of prisons and the need for guidelines and oversight. This wasn't an issue that was raised as a complaint in this mission. There were some issues that were brought to my notice in terms of private contractors and the lack of accountability for misconduct on the part of private contractors. At the level of the state, I was informed that there are penalties, including that contractor never being hired again. But I think it's also a challenge when I didn't have documentation showing me, in terms of accountability, how cases against private contractors had been addressed. And I think this is something that I see as follow-up work at the national level for activists who work, for advocates who work at this level to ask for instances and conclusions that have arisen out of complaints around violations by particularly with outsourced prisons. The challenges of accessing legal remedies, particularly the impact of the Prison Litigation Reform Act. My report has a whole section on that. There are challenges when these custodial settings are so far away from the city centers, away from where civil society organizations that provide legal services are, and in the Oakland area of San Francisco, we had a civil society organization that actually does provide free legal services, pointing out that it takes them more than an hour to get to a custodial setting, whether it's a detention center or a prison, and that it's not an ideal situation in terms of resources, and these are civil society organizations that function on limited budgets. They would do more if they could. So I think that's another aspect in terms of access to legal remedies for women who are incarcerated. What is the state response to this, and how can the non-state sector address this as a challenge? So many of these, these are just 7 of the findings from the 98 report, and I think that almost all these 7 challenges continue to exist, and I can see that this would be something that civil society advocates in the U.S. Can think about in comparing the 98 mission report, my mission report, to track what is going on and have there been changes. Next. Okay, next. Have we been lost? Hello? Looks like it. I can't hear anyone. Hello? I'm going to call her. What's her name?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Violence against women in custodial setting, also allegations of rape and sexual assault by staff or other inmates. The sexual misconduct by staff, use of position of power to coerce sexual activity, sexual advances in exchange for phone calls, visits, or basic supplies such as food, shampoo, soap, sanitary pads. High incidence of verbal abuse and general mistreatment by both male and female guards. And this came out very clearly that the female guards in many ways feel that they have to behave like the male guards and treat women in the same abusive way as their male counterparts, or they would be, they're seen as soft on women inmates. Inadequate access to basic hygiene products, the high cost of telephone calls, and inadequacy and sufficiency of the food served. I did during this mission, because the high cost of telephone calls came up over and over again, and it was, for women, it was difficult keeping in touch with their families because they could not afford these costs. And one of the questions that I raised constantly with the authorities was that I know in the federal prisons it's subsidized and the costs are lower, but in the state prisons and detention centers, the service providers, of course, dictate the costs of these telephone calls, but I could not understand why this could not be, if the federal government could negotiate this, why the state government could not negotiate a more reasonable cost. I mean, sometimes people said they were paying like $10 for a 3-minute call. So I think that's a challenge as well. The poor state of health services, including mental health. In some places they had very sophisticated systems, including one facility having its own MRI machine. But the question was that this was insufficient if people had to wait and people had to prove that they needed something. And one woman in my report, I talk about a woman who had been complaining about not feeling well, about a lump in her breast, and she wasn't given access to health services, which would have identified earlier that she did have, eventually she was diagnosed with having cancer, but it's something that could have been tracked earlier when she was complaining. So the health services and the mental health services in particular were issues that were raised. Inadequate systems, insufficiently responsive to gender-specific needs, included the reproductive health needs of women, as I've mentioned, and understaffed and under-resourced. Next. Overall, in custodial settings, a general over-incarceration of women, commonly for non-violent or drug-related crimes, the disproportionate impact of over-incarceration of African-American immigrant women, and the detention of individuals without valid immigrant status who are in the custody of ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement. The drug-related crimes, I have tried to establish through questioning the women that I interviewed as well as the authorities about whether the fact that many women identified themselves as being forced into being drug mules, and particularly immigrant women, or having no power to control what their spouses and partners were bringing into the residence, and then the cops doing a sweep and finding drugs in the residence, and they were being, particularly African-American women, they were being arrested as well, and whether coercion, duress, violence were factors that were taken into account. But of course, I was speaking to people who were now already in custodial settings. But the question for me was whether legal advocates in the U.S. should be looking at what sort of defenses, what sort of defense counsel, what were the arguments that were raised during the trial, and whether the issue of women being coerced and becoming drug mules, or allowing drugs to be kept on the premises because of abuse, because of duress, etc., whether that was a mitigating factor in their cases, or whether the drug laws are so strict that it doesn't matter, your defense doesn't matter, because many of these women who are there for drug-related crimes made allegations that their incarceration was due to the fact that there had been violence, there had been duress, there had been other factors, and it wasn't voluntary that they were carrying drugs. So I think that's something that concerned me about what sort of defense they had access to during the trial. In terms of looking at multiple forms of discrimination, as I mentioned earlier, I looked at African American women, Native American, and immigrant women, particularly irregular immigrant women. So African American women, the socioeconomic realities, cultural pressures that contribute to higher rates of discrimination and violence came through as causes in terms of violence against them. Underreporting some of the views that were articulated, that the partner was seen as a victim of a racist system, and there was reluctance to report a partner who was being abusive. There was also a sense of racial and cultural loyalty, so the us and them syndrome of seeing the dominant justice system, the policing, the prosecution, etc., as a white-dominated racist system, and feeling a sense of alienation and not wanting to report as because the prevalence rates are much higher than the reporting rates. Also the issue of religious faith and cultural beliefs about praying and going to church, etc., came through in certain reports that I received, that there was a different way of addressing it and not using the criminal justice system as such. Racial profiling, the allegations made of racial profiling and the higher rates of incarceration of African American women, mostly for drug crimes, could be interpreted as racial profiling of African American women. Again, my sense is I don't know enough about it. In a mission that's just about 2 weeks, it's really difficult, but this was something that came through, and again, I point out that this is something that I think needs further investigation. whether African American women are being disproportionately targeted. Immigrant and undocumented women, higher incidents of intimate partner violence were brought to my notice, vulnerability violence in the workplace, including sexual harassment, less access to legal, social, and support services, and underreporting, fear of deportation, losing their children if deported, even when they had regular status. So it's not, even the immigrant women who had regular status had these fears about deportation, etc. And in the report, I point out that immigrant women in particular here are usually of diverse ethnic backgrounds. English isn't necessarily their first language, and that their lives they live at the intersection of many manifestations of discrimination, including sexism, racism, and classism. And this is exacerbated by, sometimes the low educational level, language and literacy, and economic status. So they either unaware of the protections that are available, or they're fearful that if they do access the remedies, they will suffer criminal consequences or civil consequences of deportation, etc., if they report. I think also the sense of feeling, not feeling part of the dominant society that you live in also comes about because there are less support services in terms of their location. They might not be near people who are part of the same ethnic group or from the same geographic origins, etc. So feeling vulnerable, but at the same time feeling isolated and feeling that they have less access to legal, social, and support services, when in reality they might have, I'm not sure. But I think if you are feeling isolated, then you do feel that you don't have the same access to resources as other people, as the dominant population. Native American women, I was very fortunate to be hosted on a reservation by an amazing Cherokee community, and brought to my notice prior to the mission, during the mission, that violence against Native American women exceeds that of any other population in the country. The prevalence within the territories is linked to historical poverty and exclusion. I think there were attempts to point out that there are jurisdictional restrictions, and the legislation is inadequate as one issue. So jurisdictional issues from a legal perspective, there are law reform measures that are necessary, absolutely. And cases like the Oliphant case, the 1978 case, doesn't help the situation. There's also the failure of federal and state authorities to effectively police and prosecute violent crimes in Indian Territory. And those, it's all the jurisprudence, the challenges in the gaps in the law, and the failure to act and to implement form part of a legal response, in my view, that needs attention. And it has been brought to my notice that after the report, after the mission, and I don't think it was, as a result of the mission, but I think that there have been discussions going on for a long time about more effectively policing and prosecuting crimes in Indian Territory. So there have been both legislative and policy developments in this in this area. The challenge is, of course, I just visited one area in South Carolina, and I think that there are lessons that can be extrapolated, but I also think there are unique characteristics, and it has been brought to my notice that Native American women, particularly in Alaska, amongst all the different tribal groups that exist, the challenges, some are similar, but there are other major challenges that need research and analysis and remedies, which my hope would be that, the state looks at this as a very small picture. In my report, I address, and I acknowledge in my report that I was looking, I think, at a more well-resourced community. I was really impressed with the tribal courts, the police services, etc. But this is one community that has more resources. So I think one needs to look beyond the jurisdictional issues and look more carefully at the historical poverty, exclusion, the continuing discrimination, and inequalities that are faced by different Native American communities and in general, but Native American women in particular. As regards my recommendations in the report, looking through an international human rights law framework, the U.S. has signed the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and I suppose in some ways the positive side is that they haven't rescinded their signature like they did with the Rome Treaty for the International Criminal Court. And so I still feel a window of opportunity for advocates in the U.S. to push for the U.S. to ratify particularly the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And, all other treaties, but the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination is directly on point in many ways as a starting point to look at inequality, discrimination, oppression of women, and then look at the nexus, look at that in relation to violence against women. I also point out in this, and my recommendations are very brief, but I also, in terms of international human rights law, point out that the U.S. should consider withdrawing its reservations, understandings, and declarations to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the principles of equality and non-discrimination, substantive equality and non-discrimination, are entrenched in both these international instruments that I've pointed out. I also recommend, in relation to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, that the U.S. government should explore more uniform remedies for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. I think it should expand on federal causes of action under VAWA and, where possible, mitigate the current discrimination, increase uniformity and accountability at the state and local levels. Now, I am not a U.S. trained lawyer, and the nuances of a federal law like the Violence Against Women Act, have been pointed out to me. But in reality, it's also been brought to my notice that the Violence Against Women Act is basically seen as a funding mechanism. It's about incentivizing states to do things in a way that would meet the due diligence obligations of the state, which is about prevention, protection, punishment, investigation and punishment, and providing redress and remedies which would include reparations, so that the U.S. government would meet its customary law obligations in terms of the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So here's a piece of legislation at the federal level which is regarded as the remedy for the U.S., but in practice, advocates were arguing that actually it's a funding mechanism. And it has, people were praising this legislation as having expanded the groups that it's brought under its umbrella, as the years have moved on. But the challenge is if it's being seen as a vehicle for funding and incentivizing states to meet the due diligence obligations of the U.S. government, then there is a challenge that one needs to look at. I also propose that the existing mechanisms at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels for protecting victims and punishing offenders should be reevaluated, considering that the consequences are that, minimal arrest and successful prosecutions are the norm rather than the exception, that the mechanisms need to be reevaluated and analyzed to see whether, meaningful standards for enforcement of protection orders, for consequences of failure to enforce a protection order, for actual prevention of re-victimization, that there should be an analysis of whether the existing mechanisms work at all these 4 levels. I also recommend dialogues at every level, local, national, what you call the state level, federal level, to consider the effectiveness of existing laws and policies and programs, including mandatory arrest policies, prosecution policies, and bachelor's programs. It was brought to my notice that in 2011, there is skepticism regarding the state's response, particularly to domestic violence. and the disparate impact on the ground of measures such as mandatory arrest policies, which have often led to dual arrests of people in an intimate partner relationship where there is abuse. Mandatory prosecution policies, which ignore the agency of women, which actually lead to harmful consequences. Buttress programs, which look fine on paper, but which actually, in the long term, don't serve the purpose, which is about changing behaviors, and the fact that the repeat offender rate is pretty high, and so the value added of these programs. The other aspect was to review these policies in light of the disproportionate impact that violence has on poor minority and immigrant women. I also received reports about gun control measures which are not serving the purposes of prevention, of protection, etc., the due diligence obligation again, because of lax background checks to the system, where there isn't a continuous checking periodically to determine whether someone still is suitable to be owning a gun. The gun removal policies when intervening in domestic violence cases, including the possibility of removing guns after the first notification of domestic disputes, wasn't the norm. The punishing, one of the recommendations from an advocacy group was that gun dealers should be penalized for illegally selling guns and also for failure to report stolen guns, which are then used to commit crimes generally, but crimes against women in particular. So I know this is a sensitive subject in terms of gun control measures in the U.S., but these were some of the challenges that victims of domestic violence in particular face with the use of guns in to violate their rights. I also, and I had far more recommendations on domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking because the prevalence rates of these forms of violations were much higher than other forms of violations. But the effective implementation, regulation, monitoring, and evaluation of the Violence Against Women Act housing provisions, including making available more affordable, secure housing options for those that are fleeing domestic violence, re-examining federal and state housing policies which in fact discriminate against victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking by excluding them as applicants or evicting them based on their histories of abuse. And I think, again, it's this dissonance between policies and programs, but the reality on the ground. You know, the eviction histories the eviction stories that I heard, it's about discretion and about how policies are implemented or interpreted. Looking at labor laws also was a recommendation to prohibit discrimination against survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault. You know, looking at labor laws and the need to provide for emergency leave when employees need time to address safety, health, housing, and other legal concerns, including issues around children. The issue of courts and the granting of protection orders, criminal convictions, but looking at and analyzing the way courts function in terms of the due diligence obligations of prevention, protection, punishment, etc., about ordering safe and appropriate parenting arrangements, asking and considering during trials or during applications for protection orders, history of domestic violence, prior orders of protection. One of the things that I do know, you have far more sophisticated computer systems in terms of being able to track a victim, a perpetrator, a family through your systems. You have families, specialized family courts, etc. So I'm not sure where it breaks down in terms of not being able to track a history. Is it that the court personnel don't have the time because of the prevalence rates? because of the number of applications for protection orders or the number of criminal charges that are laid and trials that come up, that there isn't an application of, of a whole lot of safeguards prior to a protection order being granted or during a criminal trial. So I'm not too sure where the system, is it about technology or is it about just a question of time when these cases are being processed? So I'm not quite clear, but I do know that these were issues that came up, the failure to protect statutes, which, remove children from non-offending caregivers. And in a sense, it makes me think, okay, so when an order of this nature is granted, are all the facts taken into account that this family, this woman and child could have been in the system many times? There have been prior complaints or protection orders, and, the failure to protect penalizes her one more time. In terms of the military, the effective, as I said, there are policies, there are laws, there are programmatic efforts going on, but the effective implementation of a no zero tolerance policy for rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, the ensuring adequate investigation of all allegations by independent authorities, allowing victims to bring claims against the military when damages arise out of negligent or wrongful acts was something that came up. Some of this requires a review of legislation where there are gaps, where the challenge has been the interpretation of certain legislation or policies. And so there needs to be a review of that. But some of it has got to do with just lack of effective implementation. The implementation of training for all SAPRA employees, including victims advocates, etc., is a recommendation that I make, that the role and authority of the SOCs should be strengthened beyond the current advisory role. To enable the government should look at enabling more female-only and service-specific inpatient PTSD and MST programs within the VA to ensure victims a safe place to seek assistance without threats of further harassing behavior. This recommendation comes out of allegations that I received that many veterans, I think 16% of veterans, from what I remember in the report, used VA services because further harassment was taking place, including sexual harassment when they went in to access services. So I think that when you have a 16%, which is pretty low, of people using the services, there is a need to relook at the challenges of effective implementation of the policies of the services that are offered to women in the to veterans. Women in detention, many of my recommendations reflect the 1998 recommendations because, as I mentioned, some of the challenges continue to exist. There are international legal standards and norms for the protection of prisoners and detainees, and I think that it would benefit the U.S. to look at those and adopt those standards, those normative frameworks, and implementation, of course, of laws, policies, and programs at all levels. To also explore and address the root causes, including the multiple and intersectional challenges, which have led to excessive incarceration, particularly of immigrant and African American women in prisons and detention facilities, to understand why the prevalence, the numbers are going up in terms of incarceration. Consider alternatives to incarceration, particularly for women detainees who are primary caregivers of their children. And, in most instances, the nature of the crimes is nonviolent crimes for which they were incarcerated. And consequences of incarceration, the loss of parental rights, the termination of parental rights. I link that to something that I spoke about earlier, the high costs of telephone calls, the geographic location of detention centers and prisons, both federal and state levels, which actually preclude incarcerated women from having a meaningful relationship, whether telephonically or routine visits, because of costs of keeping in touch telephonically, cost of transport to have their families visit them, and having a meaningful relationship with their children is precluded, and loss of parental rights as a consequence of lack of contact or a lack of having a meaningful continuous relationship. I think it was a period of 15 months. I thought the consequence was pretty problematic and needed to be looked at because there are structural barriers to exercising their parental rights which need to be addressed. I also recommend that the U.S. government should look at amendments to the ASFA. I'm trying to figure out what the acronym is now. It is the legislation that relates to the termination of parental rights, and that there should be a more balanced approach when assessing the interests of a child's welfare and the parental rights of incarcerated or detained women. And I understand in many of the contexts that I work in that the best interest of the child is an issue. But when the best interest of the child cannot be served by an incarcerated mother because of structural challenges that she faces, then I think there needs to be a review of legislation such as this. Two women that I interviewed actually said, you know, when they get arrested, they don't mention that they have children simply because they do not want, and you know, their hope is that their family, extended families or their neighbors would take care of the children until such time there's a resolution to their matter or that they're released, because they do not want their children to get into the system, they do not want their parental rights to be terminated, and so they keep it sort of under wraps. Also, I recommend that the sentencing policies should reflect an understanding of women's levels of culpability and control with drug offenses. So review laws that hold women responsible for their association with people who are involved in drug activities. In many ways, these are victims of, you know, the primary perpetrators of drug activities, but it's these women that get punished. And often because they have no knowledge of what is going on, or there's coercion or duress. We also saw some really well-run programs to equip inmates with marketable skills for reintegration into society. But there's no consistency. It doesn't apply across all federal and state prisons, and it's not accessible to all women prisoners. So women who were in detention centers or in state prisons awaiting immigration status resolutions, resolution of their cases, did not have access to marketable skills programs, etc., or education programs. So I said my recommendation is that there should be more consistency around these programs, because often the people waiting for resolution of their immigration status cases spend a long time in these centers. I've mentioned the use of restraints on pregnant women during labor or delivery, and I do recommend that there should actually be legislation banning it, because at the policy level there is a policy. Unfortunately, the interpretation of the policy is not effective, so I'm recommending legislation. I also recommend laws which criminalize sexual abuse and other misconduct. And I'm not going to go through, but I do have some recommendations on looking at the prison rape elimination legislation, etc. The strengthening of institutional oversight is a recommendation as well, and it would be, you know, imperative for advocacy groups to look at access to information on what sort of institutional oversights exist and whether they result in a comprehensive approach to prevent and respond to rape and sexual abuse. Amending the Prison Litigation Reform Act also is a recommendation so that there can be equal protection before the law. There were many complaints. And I have two more slides. Violence against women in detention, again. And many of these recommendations reflect my predecessors' recommendations because they, during my mission, these were challenges that were raised again. Cross-gender searches and the lack of privacy was an issue that came up, and my recommendation is that international standards regarding the treatment of prisoners should be the norm in the U.S., and these standards should be adopted. Unnecessarily invasive and degrading strip searches procedures should be eliminated. I had interviews of women who, because of this invasive and degrading nature of these strip searches after having visits, women are saying, I'd rather not have visitors if I have to go through this process each time I am visited. So I think that needs to be addressed. National standards to transform the immigration detention systems into a truly civil model is a recommendation because at the moment the immigration cases are treated in the same way in terms of convicted, they're treated in the same way as convicted individuals. The location of immigration detention facilities closer to urban centers where legal services and family members are more accessible is a recommendation. There are recommendations on Native American women, finally, which I look at prioritizing public safety on Indian land by fully implementing and funding the Tribal Law and Order Act, assisting tribal authorities in their efforts to respond to violence against women by allowing law enforcement agencies to access federal criminal databases. Would be a good start in terms of re-victimization, of prevention, and addressing the issue of impunity and lack of accountability for violations of the rights of Native American women. Accountability for investigation, prosecution. As I mentioned, I've heard that there have been developments at the federal level to have more prosecutors prosecuting these crimes, so more effective enforcement, also more effective enforcement of tribal court protection orders, increasing resource allocation to Indian tribes and to nonprofit organizations that work on these issues, including services to women, developing comprehensive services for sexual and domestic violence. There needs to be more resources allocated. And in terms of law reform, looking at restoring, in consultation with Native American tribes, I think this was quite a sensitive perspective that was brought to my notice, legislating, but in consultation with the tribal groups, to enforce tribal law over all perpetrators, both native and non-native, who commit acts of sexual and domestic violence within their jurisdiction. I think that's it from my perspective, and I'm open to a few questions. I know we're running out of time.
Rashida,
we'll take two questions, Terry.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I know
I'm sorry it took so long.
No, it's fascinating and wonderful and incredibly important. We did have a large number of questions that were submitted. How about if I just take the first two that were on the list? The first question then is, your recommendations to the United States are very much welcome and will be an important tool for advocates to use in pressuring the U.S. into ensuring that domestic violence issues are effectively addressed in law, policy, and practice. So given your extensive experience across the globe, what advocacy strategies have effectively worked in implementing your recommendations?
Thank you, Terry. The challenge, Terry, is that unfortunately, in terms of implementing my recommendations, the mandate is 17 years old. I have not had feedback at the from the country level, advocates coming back and saying, these are the strategies I've used from an advocacy perspective, using your report to get my government to engage with at the first point and to implement your recommendations. Now, as a Special Rapporteur, my recommendations are not enforceable by me. There is one advocacy strategy which I have received information about. My predecessor had gone to Colombia, and an NGO in Colombia, and that's the only advocacy strategy that I know about, took responsibility. For 10 years, they have tracked what the government has done in terms of implementation of the recommendations in the report on Colombia. And they bring this report to the notice of civil society generally, but also to the government to reflect all the time in 10 years the steps that the government has taken, but also the retrogressive steps that have occurred. So for me, this engagement in the U.S. is a very positive development. This is the first time in my 2 years of experience where there's a concentrated effort by advocates across this country who have been engaged prior to, during, and now post the mission, who are asking, what can we do? And so it's not an advocacy strategy that reflects what has been successful in other countries, but from my own thinking through this is my recommendation to all of you would be, in terms of an advocacy strategy, is to continue to do the kind of research that I had access to, I was privileged to have access to before I conducted the mission. The analysis in the research reports were invaluable in terms of being able to identify what the issues were, and to have a consistency in your interactions with the state, because the biggest challenge for me is if you do not have the interactions and the dialogues with the state at the national level, and I talk about national in the context of a country level, so at every level, at the local, the tribal, the federal level, if you do not have and bring to their notice these recommendations, but also a constructive dialogue and engagement, I'm not sure that the recommendations will be implemented in any constructive way without visibility, without a continuous oversight by civil society through a process of analysis, research, and a consistency in dialogue and interaction. The Colombia example that I cited is one where one particular NGO took responsibility to track what was going on in the country and measure those developments against the recommendations. And, you know, I heard often it was 2 steps forward and 5 steps back. But I think about the constant engagement with with their own government and sending the reports to my mandate. So I see that as a strategy of the continuation of the work that has already started, but a more pronounced interactive dialogical process with government about the recommendations not only of this report, but also the recommendations and findings of the Inter-American Commission's, the Gonzalez case, well, the Lenahan case. So that's the strategy that I would recommend at a national level. At the international level, I would love to receive reports periodically which tell me that there have been changes, because the state won't necessarily inform me of developments, of changes. I wish they did, but I suppose governments have so many other things to do. But it would be great to continue to receive, as an advocacy strategy, updates from advocates on where there have been developments or where there has been a lack of development or a setback. And yesterday, I heard I was talking to an advocate who works in the U.S., and she said, because of the economic meltdown, there's one state that has decided that they will not prosecute domestic violence offenses. And I said, you need to send this to me as a complaint, as an allegation, which my mandate needs to investigate. Because that's the other thing, about the mandate, is I can receive these complaints. Your government does not have to be a party to CEDAW. You do not have to exhaust your domestic remedies. But I think it's really important when the economic meltdown is used for prosecution services to now make decisions about what sort of cases will be prosecuted. And if domestic violence cases fall off the radar, then I think that's a serious concern for my mandate and for advocates in the U.S.
That's really wonderful news. Yeah, that's Kansas. There's a county, Shawnee County in Kansas that encompasses Topeka, a very large city in that state. And they, in fact, have threatened to shut down there, to really let domestic abusers go free.
Right.
Simply because they don't want to spend the money to prosecute them and keep women safe from them. It's really an outrage. Well, Rashida, if you have time for one more question,
Okay.
I have a whole bunch here. I'm going to go in order, if that works for you, or unless you want to take me. Would you like me to take one last question out of order?
The one would be great, because I do need to leave. I have another appointment.
I know, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to take the question a little bit out of order. I'm going to go to question number 7. Just very briefly, because I know you've given some thought to this, and the question is, what strategies do you suggest for making the insights and recommendations in your report accessible to poor women, women of color, women with disabilities, and women from other marginalized groups?
Okay. My last report, Terry, to the Human Rights Council in June of this year, and it's accessible on the website of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is I address this issue of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and the nexus of violence again, but its disproportionate impact on these marginalized groups. And one of my strategies that I encourage states to do is, first of all, is about more decentralization of services, whether we're talking about justice, counseling, economic services, education, etc. So more decentralization, but without a cut in resources, right. Financial and human resources, which is a crucial element, because what I am finding where there is a federal system is that it's left to the states and the local authorities, but they don't get the same kind of resources in terms of meeting a state's due diligence obligations for prevention protection. So the decentralization, but without a cut in resources, human or financial. The second aspect of decentralization is that, in fact, I think one needs more oversight and accountability measures built in, so that when you decentralize services to the lowest level, lowest local levels, they become more accessible, but there is greater scrutiny in my view. There should be greater scrutiny, because it's about meeting the needs of the most vulnerable. So that's my one recommendation, is more decentralization, but more oversight and accountability measures, so that we can see that the intended beneficiaries' needs are being met. The inclusion of the more marginalized voices in law, policy, and programmatic discussions and decisions, I think, is crucial. And tied to that is, I think there needs to be more questioning of the more dominant voices and demands that claim to speak on behalf of all women in a country, in a state, in a locality, because that's, my report argues that the responses of a state are based on whose voices get heard. And the voices that get heard are the more urban-based, more educated, more elitist women who claim often, in some contexts, that they speak on behalf of all women and they speak on behalf of the most vulnerable. I'm not dismissing that there are instances where there is that grassroots work going on. What I'm saying is that I think the state has a responsibility to actually question sometimes the more dominant voices and demands and include the less visible, the more marginalized voices in the decision-making around laws, policies, and programs. And when it comes to the groups that you're identifying, poor women, women of color, women of disabilities, we know that they are more invisible in all our societies. We know that they're more silenced. We know that they don't have the kind of access that a more educated, more urban-based woman has. And I think that at the state level, there needs to be more questioning about the dominant voices and the demands that are being articulated in the name of others. But I think at a personal level, each one of us as advocates doing this work, we need to question our own voices and on whose behalf we speak, and whether the views that we articulate will actually serve the greater good, and how should we do our work in a more ethical, more responsive way. This is no criticism on anyone. It's just an analysis that I see, the voices that I hear, and I ask myself, are you really speaking on behalf of the most invisible person that I'm not seeing in the work I do? So that would be my plea in terms of a recommendation.
And I could not agree with you more. I think that is exactly the challenge for governments and agencies and non-governmental organizations, and in particular for women's organizations. I think that's absolutely right. Well, I know that your time is limited, and so I'm going to say thank you so very much for your excellent presentation. I do want to mention that your full report can be found on the website for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we will put a link to your report on the Now Foundation webpage, as well as a link about this webinar on the Now Foundation webpage. I also did want to mention that many individuals and groups, including Now Foundation, have worked to help identify the concerns about violence against women that you've addressed, Rashida. And these include, first and foremost, Professor Dina Hurwitz of the University of Virginia School of Law's Human Rights Law Clinic. She has just done amazing work, has provided invaluable leadership, and she's been assisted by a large number of law students who've done incredible work as well. Others who have made important contributions are almost too numerous to name. I'm going to name just a few, but we're going to put the entire list on the Now website next to the link to really thank people. It's the Advocates for Human Rights from Minneapolis, the American Civil Liberties Union Women's Rights Project out of New York, American University's Washington College of Law right here in D.C., the project on addressing prison rape, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California Hastings College of Law, the Center for Reproductive Rights in New York, which has just done amazing work in this area, Human Rights Watch out of New York, the Indian Law Resource Center, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, Justice Now from San Francisco, the National Congress of American Indians Task Force on Violence Against Women out of Washington, D.C., the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty from Washington, the New York Legal Assistance Group, the Opportunity Agenda from New York, the Service Women's Action Network, which is based in New York, University of Cincinnati's College of Law, the Domestic Violence and Civil Protection Order Clinic, the University of Miami School of Law, the Human Rights Clinic, the University of Virginia School of Law, their International Human Rights Law Clinic, that's down in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Women of Color Network, and the Yale Law School's Detention and Human Rights Project of the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic. That, of course, is in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you so much for your participation.
Can I just add something?
Yes.
This is the first time for me that there's been this kind of sustained engagement on about a mission. And, you know, prior, during, and now post the mission. And I see this as an opportunity to think about how to strengthen. I mean, now I'm going, this is self-interest manifesting. I'm thinking about how we can make this engagement meaningful so that the work of special procedures in general, we consider the eyes and ears of the human rights system within the UN because we can say things, we can go to places that many other UN entities cannot. So it's a very valuable system, but it's also a very undervalued system, you know, from every level of resource constraints to whatever. But I see this as a start of thinking through, is there a process that will evolve out of this kind of engagement that might serve, I hate using the word as a model, but as a best practice possibility of how in other countries women's rights advocates can think about follow-up, well, not only follow-up work, but work of how to inform the mandate before I get to a country, but a more sustained analytical way so that my work is enhanced and relationships are built, but also the post the mission work, and whether we can think, and I'm thinking through, the U.S. is the first time, this mission report is the first time where there's been this kind of engagement. So I think there's a larger project here than just about a mission report to the U.S. So I think we all can think about that.
Brilliant. I think there is definitely a larger project here, and as you said, involving the other marginalized groups and really focusing on the organized, the parts of the organized women's movement. The organizations do exist. Women
Yes.
of color organizations do exist, but as you say, they are even more poorly resourced than the more traditional women's organizations, and that is something that we need to focus on and to bring in those groups that have crucial information that other groups don't have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rashida.
Thank you.